James Alexander Smith was a man of the modern world, a monument of power, wealth, and ambition. At 47, he possessed everything a man could dream of: lavish mansions, gleaming sports cars, extravagant parties overflowing with champagne and laughter. Yet, on that fateful night, beneath the dim glow of a city that never slept, he realized there was a gaping void in his life, something money could never buy. He had no heir, a child, a fragment of his soul, to carry on his legacy when he was gone. James did not believe in love. 2 failed marriages had taught him that love was nothing more than an illusion, a sweet yet troublesome folly. Women came and went, but a child, now that was a true investment. No emotions, no attachments, just a pure transaction. And when James set his mind on something, he was certain that, with his power, he could find a woman willing to bear his child without any emotional entanglements. The next morning, James drove his sports car through the bustling streets, but his mind was elsewhere. He was searching for a candidate, a woman who would accept this arrangement. As he stopped at a red light near the city center, an unusual sight caught his attention. On the sidewalk, amid the hurried crowds, a young woman sat on the ground, a piece of colored chalk in her hand, diligently drawing on the dull gray pavement. Her brown hair was a tangled mess, and her striking blue eyes held a weariness, a solitude that set her apart from the world around her. No one noticed her, as if she were nothing more than a ghost drifting through reality. James frowned. Who could sit there drawing as if nothing else in the world mattered? The light turned green, and he accelerated away, yet the image of her lingered in his mind. A few blocks later, he suddenly pulled over, gripping the steering wheel tightly. What the hell was he doing? But instinct whispered something different. Unable to shake the feeling, he turned the car around. She was still there, as if the world beyond her didn't exist. James pulled up to the curb, rolled down the window, and spoke with unwavering authority. "Hey you, come here." The woman looked up, suspicion flickering in her eyes. She didn't rush, didn't react with the eager desperation of most homeless people at the sight of a wealthy man in an expensive car. Instead, she observed him with a cold, assessing gaze. She spoke slowly, her voice laced with caution. "What do you want?" James studied her before replying. "Get in. I want to talk." She let out a dry, amused laugh. "I'm not the kind of woman you think I am, if that's what you're after." James's expression darkened. "I don't have time to explain. Either get in, or stay here on the sidewalk." Silence stretched between them, taut and unyielding. But then, as if drawn by an unseen force, she reached for the door handle and stepped inside. The car sped through the streets, leaving the flashing city lights behind. They stopped at a quiet cafe, where conversations were nothing more than soft murmurs drifting through the air like the steam from freshly brewed coffee. James pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his gaze steady. "What's your name?" "Mia Parker." "But why does that matter?" Her voice remained guarded. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I want to know who I'm dealing with. Now tell me, why were you sitting on that sidewalk drawing, as if nothing else mattered?" Mia shrugged, avoiding his eyes. "What else is there to do? I have nowhere to go. I've lost everything." James had no interest in her tragic backstory. He was here for one reason only. And he got straight to the point. "I want you to have my child." Mia froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. She must have misheard. "You're joking, right?" James shook his head, his voice unwavering. "I'll cover all your expenses. Ensure you live comfortably throughout the pregnancy. And once the child is born, you'll receive enough money to never worry about financial struggles again." Mia let out a sharp, bitter laugh, crossing her arms. "Is this some kind of sick joke? What kind of man makes a proposal like that to a complete stranger?" James remained calm. A man who knows exactly what he wants and doesn't waste time. She stared at him, searching for any sign of deception. But in his ice-cold eyes, she found nothing but absolute seriousness. It was an absurd proposition, yet entirely real. Logic told her she should refuse immediately. But deep within her weary soul, she knew this could be the one chance to change her fate. And in that moment, neither of them realized that this decision would set off a chain of events that would shake James Alexander Smith's world to its very core. This is insane. At last, Mia broke the silence. Her voice trembled, not from fear but from sheer disbelief. No woman in her right mind would agree to something like this. James remained unfazed. He maintained his poised stance, exuding an unsettling confidence. "No woman in your position would refuse," he replied, his voice low and resolute. "I'm offering you a way out, comfort, stability, and a new life, in exchange for something you already have the ability to do: bear a child." Mia crossed her arms, trying to appear steadfast, but deep down, she knew James was right. She was living in uncertainty, each passing day an endless battle. The biting cold, the gnawing hunger, the humiliation of being invisible to the world. It was a relentless struggle. The thought of trading something so personal for money unsettled her, yet she couldn't deny the undeniable appeal of his offer. She took a deep breath, her voice heavy with doubt. "What happens after the child is born?" James leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze sweeping over her, as if he had already anticipated the question. "Once the child is born, I will have an heir to continue my legacy. And you? You will be free. No obligations. You can do whatever you want." Mia let out a short, bitter laugh. "How do I know you won't change your mind? I don't want to be dragged into a legal battle over this someday." James studied her for a long moment before giving a small shrug, his tone cold and calculated. "Mia, I'm a businessman. I don't enter agreements unless all parties are ensured mutual benefit. You'll have a legally binding contract. Neither of us will be able to alter the terms afterward." She remained silent, his words echoing in her mind. The promise of stability, even if only temporary, was tempting. She had nothing left, not even a place to sleep that night. But she also knew she was standing at a crossroads, about to make a decision that could change her life forever. She leaned forward, her gaze challenging. "And if I say no?" James smirked faintly, exuding absolute certainty. "Then you go back to the streets, battling the cold and hunger. The choice is yours." His words cut through her like a sharp blade. She wanted to hate him for his bluntness, but what she hated even more was the truth in his statement. He had cornered her, and she knew it. But there was still one thing she needed to understand. Lifting her head, she locked eyes with James. "Why me? A man like you, with all your wealth and power, why not adopt a child? Or find one of those affluent women who love parading around with their perfect children?" James took a deep breath, and for the first time, a flicker of hesitation crossed his eyes. "Because I want something that is mine, an heir who carries my blood. And because adoption or entangling myself with someone in my social circle would create complications I'm not willing to deal with. I want control, Mia. Nothing more, nothing less." The coldness in his words made her instinctively turn away. James wasn't lying. It was this terrifying honesty that made her feel vulnerable. "I need time to think," she finally said, trying to reclaim some semblance of control. James nodded, as if expecting this response. "You have 24 hours. After that, don't bother reaching out." He rose from his chair and strode out of the cafe without another word. Mia watched his figure disappear, feeling as though she was being pulled into a storm she had no control over. That night, she sat on a bench in the park, staring up at the clouded sky. Her mother had once told her, "Opportunity knocks only once. Either you take it, or you let it slip away forever." But was this opportunity worth the cost? A child wasn't just a transaction. It would be a part of her, a life she would carry within her for 9 months. But if this was the only way out of her miserable existence, then what choice did she truly have? Meanwhile, in a lavish penthouse atop a towering skyscraper, James sat alone, reviewing the contract his lawyers had meticulously drafted. He despised waiting, but he knew Mia didn't have many options. If she refused, he would move on to someone else. Simple as that. The phone rang in the silent room, breaking the heavy stillness like an unexpected gust of wind rippling through a tranquil lake. James picked up, his voice calm yet authoritative. "Bring her up." A few minutes later, when they finally arrived, James quietly stepped out of the car, walked around the front, and opened the door for Mia. A seemingly simple gesture, yet it caught her by surprise. For a brief moment she paused, her gaze sweeping across his face, a difficult expression to decipher, as if he was concealing deep, unspoken thoughts. "Thank you for today," Mia said softly as she stepped out of the car. "It's the least I could do," James replied, his voice calm but avoiding direct eye contact. His brevity wasn't distant. Rather, it felt like a curtain hiding something not yet ready to be revealed. Mia stood still, watching as he strode toward the mansion. His posture remained impeccable, each movement calculated and controlled. But somewhere in those steps, in that steady breathing, something had changed. Was it the quiet rhythm of her own heartbeat stirring a hidden part of James, or was it merely her imagination? In the days that followed, Mia began to notice small changes, subtle, almost insignificant, yet surprising. James appeared more frequently in the shared spaces of the house. He was no longer just a silent shadow, but started engaging in conversation, brief words, but no longer mechanical. He asked about her appointments, inquired about how she was feeling, and even suggested activities to help her relax. These questions, though simple, felt like raindrops soaking into the dry soil of their distance. One evening, as they were having dinner in the usual silence, James unexpectedly broke the routine. "Have you thought about what you'll do once all of this is over?" Mia was caught off guard. It was the first time he had ever brought up her future, something she never imagined he cared about. "I don't have any plans," she admitted. "I still don't know what my life will look like after all of this." James nodded, his eyes weighing her words carefully. "You'll have every resource to start over, anywhere you want. Just make sure you do something meaningful." Mia studied him with curiosity. Beneath his cold demeanor and calculated choices, perhaps there was a sliver of genuine concern. She wasn't sure how to interpret it, but for the first time, she didn't feel completely alone in the vast mansion. The next morning, Mia found a package outside her door. A carefully wrapped gift with a small note, written in neat handwriting. "To help you relax a little." Inside was a new sketchbook and a set of high-quality pencils. She was stunned. How did James know she loved drawing? In one of their earliest conversations, she had only casually mentioned that she used to sketch for fun. She never thought he would remember, let alone care. That evening, as she relaxed in the garden, James walked by but suddenly stopped. "Did you like the gift?" His voice was calm, as if he wasn't particularly concerned about the answer. Mia tightened her grip on the sketchbook, her eyes reflecting a trace of surprise. "Yes," she said. "Thank you. I wasn't expecting this." James shrugged, his demeanor indifferent, but his eyes couldn't completely hide his satisfaction. "It's just something that might be good for you." Mia smiled. She held the gift a little tighter, as if it wasn't just a sketchbook, but an unspoken acknowledgement from James. However, even as life in the mansion seemed to grow lighter, Mia still felt a vague emptiness inside. The carefully arranged daily routines weren't enough to dispel the hollow feeling she carried. It was as if she was here, yet not truly connected to anything around her. James, despite maintaining his composed exterior, was also showing subtle signs of change. One morning, he unexpectedly suggested they have a conversation after breakfast, something he had never done before. Mia entered the living room, where James was waiting beside a stack of documents. "I want to go over some details of the contract," he said, getting straight to the point. Mia's heart tightened. She immediately imagined him imposing stricter conditions. "I thought everything had already been settled," she asked, keeping her voice steady. James observed her for a moment before continuing. "Nothing has changed. I just want to make sure you understand how things will proceed after the birth. I don't want any surprises." Mia took a deep breath. "I think I understand. I'll leave, and you'll continue with your life." James nodded, but then his voice softened slightly. "However, I want you to know, if you ever need anything after that, regardless of this agreement, I'll still be willing to help. I don't want you to feel abandoned." Mia looked up, surprised by his words. His tone was different, as if he was trying to express something even he wasn't used to. She let out a small laugh, but this time there was no sarcasm. In it, maybe he really was changing, even if he hadn't realized it himself. That day, Mia decided to explore more of the mansion. The long hallways, the grand rooms, the priceless paintings, all contributed to a luxurious yet lonely space. As she passed a small study at the end of the hallway, she noticed the door slightly ajar. James was sitting inside, holding a framed photo. But instead of working as usual, he simply stared at the picture in silence. His eyes, his posture, everything about him carried a quiet sadness. For the first time, Mia saw him not as the unshakable man she had assumed he was. She lightly knocked on the door. James startled, quickly placing the photograph down on the table. "Sorry, I didn't mean to intrude," she hesitated, her voice as soft as rustling leaves in the autumn breeze. James looked up, his amber eyes flashing with sheer surprise, as if he had just witnessed something strange, something extraordinary. "It's nothing," he replied, his deep voice warm like the notes of a violin, yet his gaze remained cold and distant. "Did you need something?" "No, I was just exploring the house," Mia hesitated, feeling like an outsider. "Wandering through a grand and majestic palace." "You seem to be deep in thought," James observed, his voice steady and devoid of emotion. He stood there like a marble statue, proud and unmoving. A heavy silence stretched between them, tense and fragile like a string about to snap. "We all have things we want to keep to ourselves," James finally said, his voice dropping lower, as if he were revealing a secret buried deep within. Mia felt as though he was a closed book, its pages filled with enigmatic, indecipherable thoughts. To break the suffocating atmosphere, she changed the subject. "This house is huge," she remarked, her voice slightly trembling. "Do you live here alone?" James nodded, his eyes distant, as if lost in another world. "I don't like distractions," he stated, his tone as cold as a winter wind. "Here, I have the space I need." Mia studied him, trying to comprehend how someone could live surrounded by such luxury, yet seem so utterly alone. "It must feel strange," she said, her voice unintentionally carrying a hint of sympathy. "Having all of this, but no one to share it with," James admitted, his voice carrying a profound sadness. He looked away, as if trying to hide the emotions rising within him. "I've gotten used to it," he added, his voice reverting to its usual cold, indifferent tone. "I don't need anyone." Mia wanted to believe him, but something in his voice made her doubt. Before she could respond, James stood up. "If you need anything, Samuel can assist you," he said, his tone firm, like a declaration. That night, Mia stepped onto the mansion's terrace. The sky was a deep, velvety blue, and the city lights below twinkled like falling stars. Sitting there, she let her mind drift, thinking about the faint heartbeat she had heard during the checkup. That sound had touched something deep inside her, stirring emotions she hadn't realized were there. As she was lost in thought, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw James standing there. He looked exhausted, yet still carried his usual rigid, detached demeanor. "Do you like this place?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "I like the silence," Mia replied honestly. "It helps me think." James stopped beside her, staring at the city lights. "Thinking isn't always a good thing," he murmured, a faint bitterness in his tone. Mia let out a small laugh, though there was little humor in it. "Try telling that to someone who spends most of their time alone," she countered. James remained silent for a while before finally speaking. "Sometimes being surrounded by people doesn't help much either," he said, his voice unusually gentle, as if he were confessing something unspoken. Mia glanced at him, sensing the weight of sorrow in his words. "Maybe what you need is something you can't control," she suggested, her voice carrying a quiet understanding. James frowned, as if ready to refute her, but then hesitated. He turned and walked away, leaving Mia with her thoughts. In the weeks that followed, Mia realized that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't maintain her distance from James. He remained mysterious, unreadable, yet there were fleeting moments when fragments of his true self seemed to emerge. And while she tried to keep her guard up, something inside her urged her to uncover the man who had brought her into this world. At the same time, James found himself grappling with emotions he couldn't quite define. He was used to an orderly world where everything was within his control. But now he was beginning to understand that life was far more complex than he had ever anticipated. Mia was no longer just part of a plan, and that realization unsettled him. The following week marked the day of the next checkup. Mia woke up early, feeling both anxious and curious. The months had passed faster than she had expected, and the thought of seeing the baby, if only on a screen, made her heart race. She wondered if James would be there for the appointment, as he had been the last time. When she came downstairs for breakfast, she found Samuel going over the schedule with James. "Are you ready?" James asked, looking up from the stack of documents before him. "I'm ready," Mia replied, trying to keep her nerves in check. Excitement and apprehension swirled within her. "We'll go together," James stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mia stepped into the car, feeling the silence between them heavier than usual. James, as always, was focused on his work, but something in his demeanor felt different. Maybe, just maybe, he was as nervous as she was, though he would never admit it. At the doctor's office, the atmosphere was as warm and welcoming as an afternoon tea. The doctor, with a gentle smile as radiant as the morning sun, greeted them. He gestured for Mia to lie down, his movements as delicate as if he were handling a precious treasure. As he prepared the ultrasound equipment, his voice resonated, deep and reassuring. "Today, we'll get a clearer look at the baby." Mia lay there, her heart pounding like a bird singing at dawn. She looked up at the screen, trying to ignore the cold gel the doctor was spreading on her belly. As the probe began gliding over her skin, she held her breath, anxious and excited, like an artist moments before stepping onto the stage. James stood beside her, arms crossed over his chest, eyes intently fixed on the screen, as if searching for an invaluable treasure. Then the most magical sound filled the room, a strong, steady heartbeat, like a battle drum stirring the soul. "Not just one, but two," the doctor exclaimed, his voice filled with surprise and delight. "This is something we couldn't see last time. You're expecting twins." Mia's eyes widened like two shimmering sapphires, reflecting pure astonishment. Twins! She had never even considered the possibility. Emotions surged within her like ocean waves, shock, joy, disbelief. Instinctively, she placed a hand on her belly, trying to feel the two tiny lives growing inside her. As for James, he was silent for a few moments, his usual composed expression giving way to something entirely new. It was a look of profound reverence, as though he had just witnessed something sacred and extraordinary. He leaned forward, his eyes locked onto the screen, seeking confirmation of the miracle unfolding before them. "Two?" he asked, his voice unsteady. "Yes, both are healthy and developing well," the doctor replied with a warm smile. The silence that followed was filled only by the rhythmic sound of their heartbeats echoing in the room, like a gentle and soothing melody. For Mia, this moment was nothing short of magical, like a beautiful dream. No matter how much she tried to keep an emotional distance, she couldn't help but feel a deep connection to the two little beings inside her. James stood beside her, just as overwhelmed. He remained quiet, but his eyes said everything. For the first time, Mia saw him vulnerable, unguarded before the realization that he was about to become the father of two children. On the way back to the mansion, the silence between them was different. Not the usual cold and distant silence, but one laden with meaning, filled with indescribable emotions. Finally, Mia broke it. "You don't seem like the type to be easily surprised," she remarked, trying to ease the tension. James sighed, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I'm not," he admitted, his voice low and steady. "But this?" He trailed off, as if searching for the right words. "This is different." Mia glanced at him curiously. James rarely showed his emotions, yet now he seemed lost in thought. "Is it scary?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned slightly to look at her before answering. "No," he said firmly. "It's humbling to know that in a few months, two completely new lives will be here depending on me." A sharp ache pierced Mia's chest. She knew that, in the end, she would have to let the children go, but hearing him speak about them with such care made her realize just how deeply she had already become attached. "They'll depend on me too," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. James nodded. "I know," he said softly. "And that's why I want to make sure you're okay, Mia. Not just physically, but in every way. That matters to me." Mia fell silent, absorbing his words. It was the first time he had spoken so openly about what they were going through together. That night, Mia was on the rooftop, gazing at the horizon when James appeared again. He looked hesitant, something she had rarely seen in his usually confident demeanor. "I can't stop thinking about what the doctor said today," he began, his voice steady but contemplative. "Our 2 children, 2 futures." Mia turned to him, surprised by his openness. "It's a lot of responsibility, isn't it?" she asked. "It's more than that," James said, his eyes fixed on the distant skyline. "For the first time, I feel like there's something in my life that I can't calculate. I can't plan who these children will become. I can't control how they'll grow." A chill ran down Mia's spine at his words. It was rare for James to admit that something was beyond his control. She realized that, like her, he was changing, perhaps reluctantly, but changing nonetheless. "Maybe that's a good thing," she said, uncertain of what the future held. "It might bring something you never expected." James looked at her, as if truly considering her words. For the first time, he seemed to accept the idea that not everything in life could be meticulously planned. In the days that followed, the news of the twins brought an unexpected lightness to the mansion. Samuel began adjusting the nursery. The room, once prepared for 1 child, was now redesigned to accommodate 2. Mia watched the transformation with mixed emotions. She knew the agreement required her to let go of the babies, but deep down, she realized that it would be much harder than she had ever imagined. As preparations continued, Mia and James began to see that the contract binding them together had become far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. The twins, not yet born, were already reshaping their lives in ways neither of them had foreseen. The days following the revelation about the twins brought a subtle, yet significant shift in the relationship between Mia and James. Though he remained the methodical and reserved man she had always known, small gestures began to emerge, revealing a side of him Mia had never expected. One afternoon, after a medical appointment, James insisted on escorting her to the car, a task he usually left to Samuel or another staff member. "Are you okay?" he asked, his deep voice as smooth as a violin's melody. He held the car door open for her, a gentlemanly gesture that caught her off guard. Mia nodded, surprised by the act. "Yes, I'm fine. Thank you." On the drive back to the estate, their usual silence was broken when James asked, "Do you need anything? Anything that might make you more comfortable?" Mia glanced at him, trying to read his expression. It wasn't just polite concern. There was something more genuine in his eyes and voice. She wasn't sure how to interpret it, but she could sense the way Mal changed in him. "Nothing to worry about for now, but thank you for asking," she replied cautiously. He nodded and returned his focus to the road, but Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, though she remained hesitant. James seemed genuinely concerned for her well-being. At the estate, she began noticing more signs of change. One day, she found a new set of pillows and blankets in her room, accompanied by a simple note, "To help you rest better." She couldn't help but smile at the gesture. It was small, but it carried weight, a silent expression of care. As she sipped tea in the living room, James entered and quietly settled into the armchair across from her. He seemed more at ease than usual, though his composed demeanor remained intact. "Did you like what I left in your room?" he asked directly. "Yes, I did. That was very thoughtful of you," Mia replied, watching him with curiosity. "Good. I want to make sure you're comfortable." "That matters to me," he said, his gaze unwavering. Mia frowned slightly. She appreciated his kindness, but there was still a wall of doubt she couldn't overcome. James was changing, or at least it seemed that way, but she still didn't know why. "You're changing, James, or at least it seems that way. But I still don't know why," she said bluntly. He stared at her for a moment, as if debating his response. Finally, he exhaled. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I am changing. But the truth is, I don't know how to be different. I'm not used to caring." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. It was rare to hear James acknowledge any vulnerability, Yet here he was, revealing a part of himself that had always been locked away. That night, Mia reflected on their conversation as she gazed at the sky from the terrace. James was not the man she had expected him to be. He was still a mystery, but there was something more human beneath his controlled exterior. She just didn't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Meanwhile, James sat in his office, staring at the contract that defined his arrangement with Mia. For the first time, he felt the weight of that document. He had started this with a clear goal, to keep things structured and move forward with his life. But now it wasn't so simple. He knew he was starting to care, and that terrified him. The next morning, James joined Mia for breakfast, something he rarely did. "There's something I want to discuss," he said plainly. Mia looked up, intrigued. "What is it?" He hesitated before answering. "I know you still don't trust me, and I can't blame you. I've never been good at trusting people, and that has made me someone who isn't easy to deal with." She remained silent, letting him continue. "I've had experiences that taught me not to rely on anyone, not to let anyone get close enough to hurt me. But with you, and with what we're building, I realize that maybe I've been wrong." She blinked, surprised by his honesty. It was rare to hear James speak about himself this way. "We all have walls, James," she said gently. "But that doesn't mean we have to hide behind them forever." He nodded, seeming to consider her words. "Maybe you're right, but change isn't easy for me." Mia offered a small smile. "No one said it would be." Later that day, James decided to take a walk with her in the garden. At first, they spoke about trivial things, but soon, the conversation drifted back to the twins. "Have you thought about names yet?" he asked, catching her off guard. "No," she admitted. "I thought that was something I should decide on my own." "I think it would be fair to do it together," he said. To Mia's surprise, she realized that James was making an effort to open up, to be more present. And while she remained cautious, she couldn't ignore the fact that he was trying. As the sun set, they sat on a bench in the garden, watching the sky turn warm shades of gold and crimson. "I never thought I'd be here, doing something like this," Mia murmured, almost to herself. "Neither did I," James admitted with a faint smile. "But maybe this is exactly where we need to be." Mia looked at him and, for the first time, saw James lower his guard. Perhaps, just perhaps, this wasn't just a contract. Maybe it was the beginning of something much greater. The morning began like any other. Mia felt the weight of the months of pregnancy in every movement, but she was determined to maintain her routine. James, as usual, was in his office, buried in stacks of documents. Their interactions had become more frequent, turning into a quiet source of comfort for both. But that day, something was different. Just before lunch, Mia felt a sudden pain. It was unlike any discomfort she had felt before. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was just another common pregnancy ache. But as the intensity increased, so did her concern. She called Samuel, who immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. "James needs to know about this," Samuel said, helping Mia sit down. "This could be the start of labor." Mia nodded, trying to control her breathing as another wave of pain hit. Samuel went to call James, who appeared in the room within minutes. Seeing her, his usually impassive face showed a rare expression of genuine concern. "Mia, what's happening?" he asked quickly, moving closer. "I think something is happening," she gasped. "The babies are coming." For a moment, James seemed frozen, but he quickly regained his composure. He grabbed his phone, ordered the driver to prepare the car, and instructed Samuel to gather everything they needed for the hospital. "We're going now," he said, his voice steady but carrying an urgency Mia had never heard from him before. The ride to the hospital was a blur of emotions. Mia focused on managing the pain, while James sat beside her, watching her with a mix of worry and determination. He held her hand the entire way, a gesture that felt automatic yet deeply meaningful. "We're almost there," he said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "You'll be fine. We'll be fine." Mia didn't reply, but there was a strange sense of calm in his words. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. A medical team was already on standby, thanks to James's meticulous planning, and Mia was rushed straight to the delivery room. He stayed with her the entire time, refusing to leave despite the staff's attempts to ask him to wait outside. "I'm staying," he said firmly, gripping Mia's hand. "I'm not going anywhere." Over the next several hours, James witnessed something he had never imagined: the sheer strength of Mia as she brought their twins into the world. Every moment felt endless, yet charged with an intensity he had never experienced before. Finally, the first cry filled the room, a sound both small and powerful, echoing like a wave of emotion. "A boy," the doctor announced with a smile. "A healthy, beautiful boy." James felt his heart pound. He couldn't take his eyes off the tiny figure being carefully placed on a nearby table. Before he could fully process what was happening, another cry rang through the room. "A girl! Your daughter!" Mia was exhausted but radiant. Her eyes were locked on the two babies being gently cleaned and wrapped in blankets. She longed to hold them, but she knew the moment would come soon. James stood there, frozen for a few seconds, watching the doctor's work. Then, as if something inside him finally gave way, he stepped closer to Mia, took her hand, and whispered, "You were incredible. Thank you." Silent tears slipped down Mia's cheeks, though she wasn't sure if they were from joy, relief, or the quiet ache in her heart. When the babies were finally placed in her arms, she cradled them carefully, feeling their warmth, their fragile existence. She studied them, memorizing every detail, their closed eyes, their tiny, instinctive movements. It was an overwhelming love, and she knew she could never part from them without carrying a piece of them with her forever. James stood beside her, watching their son. He was silent but visibly moved. When he finally held the baby in his arms, something shifted in his expression. His hardened features softened in a way Mia had never seen before. It wasn't just about an heir anymore. This was life in its purest form, a connection he had never allowed himself to experience before. When he held their daughter, James closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to imprint this feeling into his memory. When he opened them, he looked at Mia, and she saw something she never expected: genuine gratitude. "They're perfect," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. Mia nodded, still holding their son. The tears fell freely now, but she didn't care. That night, as Mia rested in her hospital room, James stayed beside the babies in the observation area. He watched them sleep, feeling a rush of emotions he didn't know how to handle. For the first time, he realized these children weren't just part of a plan or a legacy. They were his connection to something greater, something he had never allowed himself to feel before: real love. Samuel brought coffee, setting it on the nearby table. "Mr. James, is everything all right?" she asked gently. James looked at her, clearly struggling to find the right words. For the first time in a long time. "I think it is," he said. Samuel smiled and walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his children. Meanwhile, in her room, Mia woke up to an overwhelming sense of loneliness. She wanted to be happy, but she knew the contract still loomed over everything. The children, now the center of her entire existence, would not truly be hers for years to come. But when she looked toward the door and saw James stepping in with both children in his arms, something inside her shifted. He looked different, as if that moment had changed not only his relationship with the children, but also with her. He walked over to the bed, handed her the baby boy, and sat beside her, cradling the baby girl. "I don't know how, but this changes everything," he admitted, gazing at the twins, his deep voice as warm as a violin's melody. Mia nodded, knowing that no matter how difficult things might get from here on out, this moment was a miracle she would never forget. After months, the mansion was engulfed in a heavy silence. Mia knew what this day meant. The weeks following the twins' birth had been a mixture of joy and sorrow. She loved them more than she ever thought possible, but the contract was clear. Her time here was coming to an end. Today was the day she had to leave everything behind. As she packed her few belongings into a small suitcase, Mia glanced at the baby's crib, where they lay sleeping peacefully, their slumber deep and undisturbed, like two little angels. Tears threatened to spill, but she refused to cry. She didn't want her last memories to be marked by weakness. She knew what she had signed up for, and kept trying to convince herself that this was the right thing to do. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Samuel entered, her face filled with concern. "Are you ready?" she asked quietly. Mia nodded, swallowing her emotions. "Yes. Thank you for everything, Samuel." The assistant hesitated before speaking again. "Are you sure this is what you want? It seems like there's more between you and James." Mia forced a smile, though her heart felt heavy. "It's not about what I want. It's about what was agreed upon." Samuel didn't push further, simply nodding before stepping out, promising to inform James. Mia was ready to leave. As she descended the stairs with her suitcase in hand, she saw James standing in the foyer. He was by the front door, watching her intently. There was no trace of the cold, calculating man she had first met. The James standing before her now looked different, vulnerable, as if he were about to lose something precious. "Everything is ready," Mia said, breaking the silence. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step toward her, his gaze intense. "Are you really leaving?" he asked, his voice low, almost breaking. Mia felt a lump form in her throat, but she remained firm. "That was the agreement. You've done your part. Now it's time to move on." James stood still for a moment before reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out the contract, holding the document between his fingers as if it were something trivial. "This contract," he began, his voice